Obviously, you had dealings with her prior to coming to politics, and then obviously as an MP and then as leader of the opposition. What legacy do you think she leaves New Zealand?
Well, look, I think she did two things incredibly well. I think she showed exemplary leadership and made all New Zealanders feel proud with the way that she handled the Christchurch massacre. And I also think she did a good job of maintaining New Zealand's profile on the global stage, which isn't always easy, being a small country, and I think she did those two things incredibly well. I think she came with really good intentions, and I think the challenge is actually the results and actually the deliverables weren't really delivered and things weren't executed well. But, you know, I wish her nothing but the very, very best for her future and wish her very well.
Is there any particular moment of her leadership or her prime ministership that really sticks in your mind?
No, I was actually in Christchurch at that time. It was a difficult time. I'd lost an employee in the Christchurch massacre as well, and I was down there for a few days immediately after, and actually on the day of as well. And I remember meeting up with her down there, and I thought she handled herself incredibly well in what would have been a very difficult situation with a range of emotions going through it. And I thought she carried herself and the country well through that period.
One of the things that you mentioned and that the National Party is really hot on is the idea of delivery and lack of delivery under Labour. Is it a bit of an issue for all sides of politics in New Zealand, actually getting the machinery of the state to work for you?
Well, I think that's the challenge. I think politics, you know, isn't actually how you feel, it's actually what you do for people, because that's actually the thing that matters the most, is how do we make life a little less expensive, how do we make life a little more convenient, and actually how do we improve outcomes for New Zealanders so they get to improve their daily lives. You know, that's why I've come, because I want to solve these problems and get the solutions in place that lead to better outcomes and then a better future for the country. So I think, you know, that's the ambition that you have to come to this place with. You can come with good intentions, but if you can't get things done, you know, that's a real challenge and a real problem.
You talked about Jacinda Ardern on the world stage. I mean, if you were to become Prime Minister post-October and she expressed an interest in any sort of an international job, would that be something you'd be open to? Yeah,
look, I would be open to it, and we'd consider it and work out what skills that she could do and advocate on behalf of New Zealand for. You know, as you've seen before, you know, I think, you know, there's things that she could do incredibly well for New Zealand, and it's good to see that she'll have other interests and other things that she'll go on and move to do, and that's fantastic.
Today, one of the issues that Ardern faced in her last year, which is cost of living, comes back up to the front of people's minds as the Reserve Bank makes another interest rate decision today. What's your sense of where inflation is at and how it's being managed at the moment?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing to acknowledge is today is another really tough day for New Zealanders, and it's going to cause a lot of pain and suffering. And when you think about a $400,000 mortgage now being an extra $300 a week after tax that families have to find, that's incredibly difficult. You know, I sat in on some budgeting services. A family invited me in because there was a threat of a mortgagee sale with their house. And as they worked through with the budgeting counsellor and the choices that they had to make after resettling their mortgage from 2.5% to 6.5%.
Is that where that 300 numbers from?
Yeah, $400,000 mortgage. You know, think about what people had. Yeah, 2.5 to 6.5 is sort of roughly $300 a fortnight, for a week. And I know people will be in a worse position than that. But we now have almost 20,000 New Zealand families and mortgage holders actually in arrears. So it is incredibly concerning, and that's what I'm really worried and fixated about. And that's what you and I have been talking about for the last year and a half, is that, you know, essentially if you don't manage inflation well and get to the underlying causes of inflation, you end up with high interest rates. If you end up with high interest rates, you get economic slowdown. We've seen the economy shrink and the risk of recession coming, and then you see rising levels of unemployment. And so it has huge pain and suffering for people. And that's why, you know, I remember when I first met with you in that very first week, talking to you about this issue and saying there are amber lights on the dashboard. They need to trim and make adjustments now, quarter by quarter, rather than just leave everything hoping that it's going to get better. It's not going to get better. You know, we've just seen an example across the ditch in Australia. The Australians actually got to peak inflation later than New Zealand, and they ended up retreating quicker, and as a result yesterday their Reserve Bank didn't have to lift their interest rates.
What do you put that down to?
Well, I put that down to a government that actually was the second biggest in fiscal spending and stimulus. And you think about it, we spend $1 billion extra each and every week in New Zealand now, and we get nothing and no improved outcomes for it. On the other hand, you also then restricted the economy and immigration. And then thirdly, you had a Reserve Bank that actually was the fourth biggest printing of money proportionately in the world as well. So we had these 2 feet on the accelerator full out with fiscal government spending from Grant Robertson, who's addicted to spending. We had Adrian Orr and the Reserve Bank printing a lot of money, and we had the economy constrained with no immigration, with our immigration settings pulled back, and it popped and blew a lot of domestic inflation into our economy.
Okay,
and now you've got this perverse situation where the government's still spending like nothing before, and the Reserve Bank's hitting the brakes by trying to take interest rates up, and it's painful.
So you want to be Prime Minister in 6 months. What are the basic... I mean, one of the criticisms of the government has been that nothing about their underlying fiscal settings has particularly been changed. I mean, obviously there's been pullback in COVID spending as the country's opened up, but the rest has remained. I mean, what basic kind of settings would you be looking at to try and shift the dial on this?
Yeah, well, you've got to do 5 things, really. The first is you've got to stop passing costs on to businesses that lead to higher prices. So things like, national awards, national income insurance, all of those sorts of stuff. We've just got to stop that, because actually all that's happening is it's putting small businesses to the wall and leading to rising prices.
What are some other of those costs? Because insurance isn't...
Well, I think of another good example would be actually what's happened with landlords, for example. Actually removing interest deductibility and extending the Bright Line has probably added about $50 extra a week in rents, as that cost is passed to a landlord, who then passes it on to a tenant with higher rents. So, yeah, we've got to stop doing that. We have to make sure that we open up the immigration settings big time, because we're actually constraining productive growth. And while the conversation will be around borrowing and taxing and spending, the biggest issue New Zealand now faces, with a quarter of negative growth, is actually how we're going to grow the economy again. And so one of the ways we've got to be able to do that is make our firms and our sectors and our businesses be able to realise all the opportunity they can. They need a workforce to be able to do that. You've got to control spending. As we said, there's $1 billion a week being spent extra above and beyond what this government started with. And we've also got to give tax relief through our inflation-adjusted tax thresholds. Our family boost up to $3,900 a year helps in that regard as well. And then you need the Reserve Bank focus on the single mandate, get inflation back under 3%. That's your single job. Because I think New Zealanders are learning the histories that we've learnt before in the late 70s and the early 80s. If we end up in a place with high inflation and low economic growth, or no economic growth, we're in the stagflation kind of economic frame. Very, very painful, very, very difficult. So let's not go there. Let's actually make interventions now and adjustments now to actually make sure we set it up right for New Zealanders.
On the tax relief side of things, your tax indexation policy has been out for over a year now. Can New Zealanders expect something more from you in the tax space prior to the election? Well,
look, we'll have more to say about our full fiscal policy as we go to the election. But, I think we've been really upfront with the New Zealand people. We've not just been opposing this government, we've actually been proposing ideas. And you think about it, it was over a year ago we talked about indexing tax thresholds. It's a logical way to get New Zealanders to keep more of their own money in their own pocket, rather than give it to Chris Hipkins and Grant Robertson to waste it. I think the program we put together said, look, let's cut $400 million worth of consultancy spend and divert that money back to 130,000 families so they can get up to $3,900 a year to defer their childcare costs. Gives families choices about working more hours, gets people back into the workforce, which we desperately need, and most importantly, when they're getting hammered by rising interest rate, rising food, rising rents, rising school uniforms, everything, that actually is something that helps them manage their finances in a much better way. So, that's a practical, pragmatic way of dealing with it. But if you don't deal with the causes of it, you end up doing what this government's doing, which is ad hoc, tactical band-aid solutions. That cost of living payment was incredible. It cost almost $1 billion
This is one of the
last year, and it was 3 months. The economy was no better off at the end of it. People were no better off. The cost of living didn't get easier or better. And we ended up executing it so poorly, we gave it to dead people. I mean, it was a real band-aid economics, because the government's just never admitted there was a cost of living crisis until really late. Then didn't make any adjustments to its economic plan to get to the underlying causes of inflation. And actually then started doing band-aid, rink-a-dink sort of ideas that don't actually solve the core problem that we've got, which is inflation.
Can you just remind all of our viewers and readers, where's National at on scrapping the 39% tax rate?
Well, as I said really clearly, we want to make sure we can index tax thresholds to inflation so people get more of their own money. We want to make sure we deliver a childcare rebate, family boost through cutting consulting spending. We've said really clearly that we cannot afford to cut the 39% tax rate in our first term, so that's not happening.
Okay. Just moving along, having a bit of a look at last week. Remarkable last week. Stuart Nash sacked very quickly. Then it turned out the email that ended up that got him fired had been sent by the Prime Minister's office a couple of years ago. There's a Cabinet Office inquiry into all of Mr Nash's communications with donors. What did you make of it all? Is enough being investigated? What did you?
Well, I mean, firstly, congratulations to you for bringing that story to life. That was excellent, a good example of what the media should be doing. But I just sit back, I was thinking about it last night and just saying, this is a Labor government where every single week I've been discussing Labor personnel issues. We started with Rob Campbell and Ruth Dyson and Steve Mahare and now Stuart Nash and Martima Davison and Kerry Allen, and then we've got an endless nexus of deeply embedded lobbyists within the Labor Party and within this Labor government. So, those are the issues that I look at, and I go, the sad thing is, none of that it's a massive distraction for this government, and we're not actually dealing with the problems that New Zealand is facing well enough, and that's the real issue here. You've got a government that's entitled, it's arrogant, it's increasingly focusing on its own internal issues, and we're not focused on the New Zealand people. And I don't think that we're doing them a good service. On the Nash case, my view was very clearly not personal, just a principled decision, which is that Chris Hipkins gave him 3 goes, got rid of him on the 4th go. And the reality was, he breached the Cabinet Manual. It was a serious, egregious breach that we haven't seen like that here in New Zealand. And you have to stand up for those absolute principles big time, because we are the second most transparent country in the world, with Finland, I think, tied with us. And the reality is we want to maintain that. But you need to have Cabinet Minister integrity, read the Cabinet Manual, understand it, internalise it, hold the position 24/7. You need former Cabinet Ministers respecting the Public Service Code of Conduct and political neutrality. And you need to make sure this nexus of people who are both staffers and lobbyists and political commentators, and all that nexus that comes together, which is unique and at a level we haven't seen before in New Zealand, all of those 3 things add up to say it's a government focused on the wrong stuff. It's just entitled. The rules don't apply to us, or we don't understand the rules. Chris Hipkins says follow the rules and no one does it. So it's a really, just as zooming out, that's a real frustration, because this country is in a really serious place. The economy needs sorting. Law and order is a challenge. Health's a problem. Education's a problem. All these issues, building an infrastructure. We've got to talk about that stuff and focus on that, because that's what we want to do to take us forward and have a good future for New Zealand. And instead, we end up doing all this rubbish because this is a Prime Minister who's not managing his team or setting the tone right and holding people to account on standards.
And if Stuart Nash wanted to leave Parliament in a couple of weeks, not triggering a by-election, would the National, I think there's 75% of support in the House, would the National Party support that?
Look, I mean, the issue on the by-election conversation was it was the tail wagging the dog, because the real issue was the principle at play about such a serious, egregious, unseen breach before, right? And the consequence would have been potentially, if he'd gone that night, a by-election for sure. I think the reality of it for us is that it wouldn't be something that we would do, because if you think about it, we're sort of 6 months out from an election, probably take us 3 months to get a ratified new candidate in Napier, and then you're actually 3 months out from starting the national campaign anyway. And I just think that would be really unfair to the people of Napier.
So if he wanted to go, requires national support in the House, you would support
we'd look at that. As he signalled this week, he's now planning to retire at the election. I just think that Napier doesn't have a great representative, and I think that's a shame for a region that's doing it incredibly tough and needs a massive focus on cyclone recovery. And I know we've got hard-working candidate there in Katie Nimmin. She'll be great and doing an awesome job, and I hope genuinely she demonstrates well to the people of Napier why she'll be such a great MP in the future.
And finally, just stepping out into huge international news this morning, Donald Trump has been prosecuted in New York. Is this a desirable thing?
Look, I mean, what it is a massive distraction for American politics. I talked about the massive distraction we've got in New Zealand politics with all the Labor government personnel issues and challenges. But it's a total distraction, And again, the world's got some serious issues to sort through, and it sucks all the media oxygen into Donald Trump, rather than the issues that the world needs to be solving and working through as well.
But I mean, I guess the thing that is remarkable about in the US, I saw some comments saying, well, if his name was anything other, we would prosecute him. However, the US has gone through, obviously, quite a period of turmoil, quite a contested election. Wouldn't it have been better to let him go quietly into the night?
Look, I'm not going to get into US domestic politics. What I'm focused on is New Zealand and making sure that we have a great future going forward in this country. You know, I feel more convinced 2 years into this job that we have an endless potential and a great future ahead of us. But I am really sober-minded about the challenges and clear-eyed about them that I see in front of us. And we have a country that's at risk of becoming broken, and we need to make sure we make powerful interventions on the economy, law and order, health, education, building and housing.
And what does Christopher Luxon do over Easter?
Well, actually, I'm actually working, and so I'll be at different events through Easter time. I'm hoping I might get a day off and be able to catch up with my wife and family would be great. So, but otherwise, I've got a number of events over the weekend.
Christopher Luxon, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Appreciate it. Good to be with you.